Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and in this Rupert's Land Part 5, I'm also going to review the differences between Métis and Indigenous nationals and help explain why I don't do work for Métis and limit what I do for only Indigenous nations. And this is going to be the last time I'm quoting from this book by George Woodcock, The Century That Made Us, Canada, 1814-1914, which was published in 1989. So, because of course the Métis were very much part of the buffalo hunt, and in the prairies, you know, we have the fur traders and we have the Métis involved in that as well. So this is a reference to a time after the second uprising of the Métis, the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, which was an issue about surveying and lands, etc. Settlement had moved over the prairie with speculators in the van, and the Métis feared they would be treated as squatters and swept away from the plots that gave them a precarious foothold in the great prairie where they had once ranged far and wide, challenged only by those other free nomads, the Plains Indians. As they themselves put it in the peroration to one of the many petitions they sent in vain to the Dominion government during the 1880s. Quote, so this is why, you know, a lot of Indigenous nationals are not aware of or recall how Métis held themselves out at the time. And often see Métis as relations. But I'm asking you to look at the politics and the realities of the time, and you'll understand why I find it a conflict of interest to assist Métis while acting to preserve Indigenous nations. So in their petition, having been so long regarded as the masters of this country, having defended it against the Indians at the cost of our blood, we do not consider that we are asking too much when we call on the government to allow us to occupy our lands in peace and to exempt us from the regulations by making free grants of land to the Métis of the Northwest. So when they learned, speaking about the Métis, when they learned that obscure negotiations between the imperial government, the Hudson's Bay Company, and the new Dominion were selling Rupert's land without their voices being heard, the Métis saw no alternative, as direct-minded men of action who in the past had taken up arms against the Indian nations, as well as the Hudson's Bay Company, but to do so again and to form their own provisional government. So, you know, in terms of this land, Métis saw the Indian nations as the enemy. And so, you know, they, of course, didn't have a good outcome on this. At the end, with the village in the hands of General Middleton's troops, Dumont came upon Riel in a wood on the outskirts. It was the last time they met, for Riel was shortly to surrender and Dumont to become a fugitive. Quote, "What are we going to do?" he said. That's Riel. He said as he saw me, "We are defeated." I said to him, "We shall perish, but you must have known when we took up arms that we would be beaten. So they will destroy us." And indeed, as the nation they had once thought themselves, the Métis ceased to exist. I remember this is in 1989, before certain cases that I'll be referring to in a minute. But my point is that there was a history here of armed conflict, of defeat in that armed conflict, and the reality of the Métis coming after the Indigenous nations and not usurping their title. They were, you know, they had possessions, if you will. They were using the land consistent. If you look at the Indigenous nation law perspective, you're to share the land. So having Métis who are, again, you know, because, you know, these are quote unquote half breeds, right? There's, you know, Indian blood in there. extended relations, they didn't have an issue sharing the land. But when it comes to this, we fought off the Indians for what is ours. We're in a different scenario here. And it's not a scenario that's initiated by Indigenous nations, but rather by the Métis themselves, for profit. It says, even today, when Native peoples' claims to recognition are being heard, and Métis leaders like Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont have been given heroic status within the national myth, the way of life they sought to preserve with its remarkable system of direct democracy is little understood. The Métis rebellions had never led to a real reconciliation, because reconciliation with an archaic minority was not seen as necessary for the survival of the community as a whole, as it had been the case of the rebels of 1837. By 1870, the Métis, quote, had seen themselves for a couple of generations as a nation, equivalent to the other powers of the West, the Hudson's Bay Company and the great Indian confederations of the plains. So, in 1869, the few Canadians who had already settled on the Red River and those who agitated in Ontario for an immediate takeover of the West, they saw the Métis as rebels, and those were rebellions, which technically they were not, since Canadian law did not yet operate in Rupert's land, and the representatives at Red River of the Hudson's Bay Company, the de facto authority there, offered no resistance to Riel's formation of a provisional government. It's important to understand, as I've discussed in the earlier parts of Rupert's Land, that it was a de facto exercise of authority, controlling as much as possible order for purposes of running a company, making sure its employees conduct themselves a certain way. And, the fact is that Indigenous nations do not appear, I don't know the history there all fully, but my understanding is Indigenous nationals didn't have issues with Métis as seen as extended relatives, but they certainly did not expect Métis to claim the land as their own to the exclusion of Indigenous nations. But the fact is that the Hudson's Bay Company had no authority to do anything about that. It was the jurisdiction remained in the hands of the Indigenous nations. So, Métis clearly seen as a minority within Canada already. And, it was in earlier times, this talking about that the Indian assumes in both these accounts is not without significance. Dispossessed, increasingly outnumbered, the natives were no longer a threat, yet they were still present, inconvenient, but benevolently tolerated survivors. Nobody at that time foresaw how ostensibly they would continue to survive. Even more so today, with all of these initiatives and all of this effort since the Constitution Act 1982, with all of the misleading advice, in terms of what Section 35 really is and what it does, and what it means to rely upon that and hold out representations based on that. The business of law, those are not necessarily people working to, they're not people working to preserve Indigenous nations. They're working to try to fit in something and get something for their clients on the basis of them not being Indigenous nations. And so, having survived all of that, survived at the time, that's a strength, that's a power that I put to you, is no accident. In effect, the fur traders were not seen as sovereigns. They claimed no right to interfere in the way the Indians conducted their lives, individually or socially. On the other hand, in their own interests, they would at times feed starving Indians and support old hunters. And doubtless on these occasions, calculation was diluted by natural benevolence. But the relationship was never one that could lead to any true rapprochement, since in real terms a class system had emerged. A system of primitive capitalism, similar to that which, before the rise of the factory system, entrepreneurs employed hand weavers to work in their homes and bring the product of their toil to a central depot. The Indians who brought their pelts to the trading forts for the eventual use of the furrier or the felt maker became the equivalent of a European proletariat. Decimated by white man's diseases, demoralized by alcohol, and eventually hunger resulting from the destruction of game animals by white men's weapons, led the natives to accept this situation with growing docility. Look at what you've been through and what you're, with what was happening before the quarantine situation hit, I didn't see docile Indigenous nationals. I saw people reminding the world, hey, this is who we are. This we're nations, we're sovereign, this is our land. They were striking at the core of the mythology that serves as the foundation for Canada. And they were telling and sharing facts. Sometimes, picking up the language that's all around that can be used to misconstrue the words. But my general observation of that time was, these are definitely not docile Indians. These are not people who have abandoned. Notwithstanding what chief and council may be involved in, they don't carry the authorities, they don't carry the powers, they're not the decision makers. And it's important to understand how, the aspect of Indigenous spirituality and religion was, seen at the time too, right? He tells in discussion of what was going on with the Hudson's Bay, he says he only tells of the natives only insofar as their lives contribute to the profits of the fur trade. And it's important to know, Indigenous nationals at that time did not know the value of their products. They were, these traders, the company, they were making like 200% profit. The Indigenous nations were not getting the value, but the Indigenous nations were getting things they wanted. So it bothers me that to this day, whenever there's a deal done, business deal, Indigenous nations are still not equals at that table. They're still not getting the deals they can get because they're operating under this primed condition of not being sovereign, of not being able to call the shots. They have been through so much. It's going to take a little time for these next generations to grow into people and leaders, and to really truly understand what their parents are teaching them today, that they are worthy people. This is a beautiful country. This country provides for them. It's their country. So this discussion about the observation as to their religious practices, if you will. His summary of native religious beliefs is as contemptible as it is contemptuous. Quote, the supreme being, and this is by Ballantyne, who was a Hudson's Bay fur trader. Anyhow, the supreme being, this is about 1848. The supreme being among the Indians is called Manitou, but he can scarcely be said to be worshipped by them, and the few ideas they have of his attributes are imperfect and erroneous. Indeed, no religious rites exist among them, unless the unmeaning mummery of the medicine tent can be looked on as such. Now, that's quite an insult. That's basically, if you look that word up, mummery, I had to. It's, ridiculous ceremony. So, how arrogant. Again, this is not really that long ago, if you think of it. The foundation of how Indigenous nationals are perceived. That how dare he... It'd be like me going to a Jewish rabbi and telling him he doesn't know his faith, that he's wrong and it's imperfect. It's really mind-boggling to think of these attitudes, right? that, oh, well, they can't possibly have it right, you know, despite thousands of years, you know, and their survival and in survival of Indigenous nationals today. I put it to you that it is the very fact of those religious ceremonies that have allowed Indigenous nationals and their nations to survive to this day. And here's another final last quote in terms of how the Métis conducted themselves back then. They stressed in their statement on establishing a commune in the 1800s, they see themselves as loyal and faithful subjects of Canada and are prepared to give up their own organization and submit to the laws of the Dominion as soon as Canada brings into their midst official magistrates with sufficient power to uphold the law of the land. That attitude in the 1800s is certainly not reflective of the attitude of Indigenous nationals. Now, why is this a problem in terms of what's happening with Métis? Well, there's been a couple of important decisions, you know, as Canada tries to manufacture and give some foundation to its myth of being. You know, we have, in 2003, we had the R versus Pali decision. That's where Métis rights are found and held to be existing Aboriginal rights protected within the meaning of Section 35. Now, that, if you compare Indigenous nations, you know, having land, etc., their attitude, separate foreign nationals, and Métis, what they said they were about, and to have these now mixed, sharing the same kind of right, that is to liquidate and diminish the actual rights and of Indigenous nationals. And then we have the more recent one, 2016, the Daniels case, Daniels versus Canada. This is where the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed that Métis are included within the definition of quote-unquote Indians in Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867. And it's interesting because, you know, this is another amendment to a Constitution Act. I've written extensively how Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 has been amended, and I say that's been done so unlawfully, unconstitutionally, hence Outlaw Nation. Well, the other second constitutional document, the Constitution Act of 1867, is effectively hereby amended by redefining the term Indians. You do not see in the treaties, you know, the references Indians in the treaties, referring to nations, the Indian nations. I don't intend to get into a full discussion of the Daniels case. I probably will do that at a further point. I just want to make this point today that by grouping and setting a stage of creating these new constitutional definitions, that joining Métis with Indigenous nationals severely weakens and in fact destroys Indigenous nations, right? Because Indigenous nations pre-exist for thousands of years before contact, right? By definition, Métis didn't come into place until you know, Indigenous nationals married into or joined with newcomers. So that's a point subsequent in time. They can't have ownership of land. They're being, you know, anything that's being done, anything that's described under Section 35, for example, and these agreements being done, I don't have an issue with it because they are not nations in the sense that the Indigenous nations are. It's a different kind of category. It's a different definition. So I caution you about that, and when time permits, I'll get further into that, and that's all I have to say for now.